Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I want to discuss our wealthy presidents. I'm discussing our wealthy presidents not because I'm particularly interested in money, but out of concern uh, about the current climate uh, that's sort of pitting the masses of Americans against the wealthy. You hear all sorts of pejoratives today. The nepo babies, where the masses, the common Americans, average Americans, seem to be disparaging children of the wealthy, and of course, this is all like a paradox, considering that America is a very capitalistic nation. It's the most materialistic society in the world. It's a society that's built on, capitalism, the notion that people should pursue happiness, and pursue happiness is normally tied with materialism, right? Consumerism. There's huge consumerism going on in America. It's a land where people are encouraged to pursue the American dream, and the American dream is invariably often linked with material success, right? Getting a house, being able to buy whatever you want to, buying cars and things like that. It shouldn't be that way because what people want to what each individual has his definition of success. But ironically, that in America, success and the American dream, pursuit of happiness, this has been linked with materialism and consumerism, right? And so it's a paradox that there's this enmity, this angst against the wealthy going on in society today, as if people wear a badge of honor. It's a badge of honor to say, well, your parents were not rich, and people, continue to propagate this false notion of the ability to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Everybody wants to be rich, but nobody has rich parents. Having rich parents is like an evil, because which is bizarre because when you get wealthy, of course, you want to provide the best things for your kids. If you're sane and you're proper, you're normal, that's what you want to do. You don't want to live your kids in an impoverished state, or to struggle the way uh, you know you did if you weren't born wealthy, or if you had to struggle, right? Then why is it that people are ending up hating those people who, whose parents were wealthy and were able to provide for them in some kind of fashion? What's going on? You know, and you see this has reached such a flashpoint, a very critical stage, with the recent killing of a CEO. It's not so recent, it's been about a year now. Was it December 9, 2024, when Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, an American insurance company, was assassinated by the suspect Luigi Mangione. I guess we still call him suspect now because the trial's still ongoing. But so he was assassinated in New York, in Midtown New York, and it's Manhattan. That's Midtown Manhattan in New York, and this is so terrible. But it's there's a parallel in history. There's a parallel in history. Uh, when I keep wondering why is there so much rancor, so much we're not a communist society, right? We're not a socialist society. Why is there so much rancor against the wealthy? To the point, it's like there's some kind of classicide going on. And being a student of history, I always remember things like the French Revolution, and I hope we all have all these safeguards, these guardrails that can forestall what happened in France. In France, the peasants, committed regicide. They killed, assassinated their king, and of course his wife Marie Antoinette. They assassinated, guillotined, the aristocrats. They started killing them. It happened in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution as well. Where they committed regicide. They killed their emperor, the Tsar, and his family, entire family, and there was a civil war there. So I'm hoping America won't get to this point. But with the assassination of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, by Luigi Mangione, the suspect, Luigi Mangione, um, I was referring to a parallel in history when Henry Clay Frick, there was an assassination attempt uh, on Henry Clay Frick by an anarchist by the name of Alexander Berkman, right? This guy tried to assassinate Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick was the head of the management of the Homestead Steel Works of the Carnegie Steel, which was owned by Carnegie Steel, right? Carnegie Steel, of course, was owned by Andrew Carnegie, who became, after he sold off Carnegie Steel, he became the wealthiest man in the world. And it's interesting that I'm going to tell the story of what caused the Homestead, strike and the assassination attempt on Henry Clay Frick. But my point is, Andrew Carnegie, who became the richest man in America, he didn't start off that way. He was an immigrant from Scotland. He came to America impoverished, and of course, he didn't have much formal education because when he came to America, he worked in a factory. He worked as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill factory, and then he worked in other factory related jobs. He worked, tending steam engines. Eventually, he made his, he would spend his spare time going to study in a library, right? And his studiousness eventually led him, and with a little bit of luck, got him into telegraph and then railroads, where he eventually made his fortune. The telegraph and the railroad back then, they were the equivalent of tech today, technology, tech companies today. How, we have all these tech billionaires today, social media tech billionaires. We know the Mark Zuckerbergs, um, Microsoft, Bill Gates and all that. So that was what being in telegraph was back then in the 19th century. And so Andrew Carnegie became super rich. But my point is, you would expect that somebody who had once worked in a factory himself would empathize with factory workers. So the Homestead Strike of 1892, this was in Pennsylvania. Um, the amalgamated association, right, of steel workers, it was a union, and Henry Clay Frick, um, he executed a wage cut. He was cutting wages, of course, so that his company could make more money, could make more profits. So he cut wages, and the workers went on strike. Back then the working conditions were deplorable, right? Working in some of those steel factories. I read a biography of a book about Henry Clay Frick and um, Andrew Carnegie. And so I was able to read of the terrible working conditions in their steel mills back then. So both of them, Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie, even though they were initially business partners, they would end up hating one another, and they stopped talking to each other, until their deaths. And so the title of the book is "See You in Hell," and it sort of explores their relationship. In the steel mills, um, they had these. They were so hazardous working in these steel mills that workers sometimes would fall into molten steel. There would explosions, right? And people would die, and there was no worker compensation back then. So the union tried to organize. Amalgamated Association was a strong union back then. So they tried to organize for better labor working conditions, better wages, because the laborers back then, the workers had worked under terrible, dehumanizing conditions back then. And again, like I said, you would expect that these factories owned by a man who had been one of them, that they'd empathize. But no, you see, the thing is, many of these people who become so super wealthy, these billionaires, and society likes to, you know, is so fascinated by these people, and there's got to be something, there's this megalomania that's probably driving them. Because why is somebody in a land where we don't have kings? Why does somebody want to be so wealthy, wealthier than a king? Andrew Carnegie became wealthier than kings. In fact, it is said he was the richest man in the world, a man who started with nothing. What is the purpose? Why does he want to be wealthier than kings? How is it going to translate? And then you see he's not a king. So there's an individual who has amassed more wealth than kings that will have absolute rule, so much power over their subjects. What is somebody who's a billionaire, the richest man in the world? What's he going to be doing, right? So he's trying to control the labor, right? He's trying to control the labor of his workers, even though he's not a king. And he has this outsized power that he uses his influence, his power, his money to dehumanize them and strip his workers of their humanity. And this was what was going on in the the Homestead Strike of 1892. Eventually, Henry Clay Frick would hire 300 Pinkertons. They were like private police back then. He hired private police to keep the strikers out of the mill, right? And then he installed barbed wire around the mill. Now these people, that was their jobs, that was their livelihood. So they tried to come back in, and instead Henry Clay Frick used the Pinkertons, right, and the guards to keep the workers out, and he got replacements for them. A fight ensued, and there was a 12-hour gun battle between the 300 Pinkertons and the townspeople, because the townspeople were supporting their laborers, right, their people, right. So you can see the history of this conflict between the common man and the big corporations and the wealthy, right? Because the wealthy management, Carnegie, they're trying to make more money, and they're cutting their wages. They're cutting their wages just so they can say they're rich, very, very rich. They're uber rich. They have, billions, and they can buy mansions and things like that. What was the purpose of, you know, you know, reducing the meager wages of people just eking out a subsistence? And so eventually there's a gun battle, right? There's a gunfight between the Pinkerton guards hired by Henry Clay Frick, the management of the Homestead Steel, and the workers, and amalgamated uh, union, and they were supported by the townspeople. Eventually, in this fight, about three Pinkertons were killed, and seven of the workers were killed. So you can see the sort of violence that um, ensued, that developed just as a result of workers just asking for better working conditions, which is their right. Back then in the 19th century, it was pretty much medieval in America, right? Working conditions were medieval, so they didn't have those rights. Late the right to unionize would come under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, when he legalized unions and the rights of workers to organize and to demand better working conditions and whatnot. So this would come under FDR. But at this time in 1892, even though the workers had an initial victory over the Pinkertons, right, and eventually the governor of Pennsylvania, Robert Patterson, would uh, would call in the 8,500 National Guard troops to install to restore order. And of course, the unions were crushed, and through the combination of the corporate interests and the state. And so you can see how workers were dehumanized. Some of them were killed. They were arrested. They were just for asking for better, wages, better working conditions in the 19th century. So I guess we could see the sort of disaffection and the suspicion of the masses of Americans, the average Americans, common Americans, uh, the disaffection and the suspicion, the resentment they often show big corporate interests and the wealthy. There's a history to that. And but of course I don't like that. Nobody wants to see that. And of course the reaction of you never know when things would get out of hand and somebody takes matters into their own hands, like this Luigi Maggioni, who assassinated uh, uh, the CEO Brian Thompson, the CEO of an American insurance company. So nobody wants to see that, but it is the right of workers to demand uh, uh, better working conditions and higher wages. Um, I've been similarly dehumanized because I was working in the federal government, which I expect to return to. But I was working in the federal government and I filed a discrimination complaint with Equal Employment Opportunity. And also concerning, included part of my discrimination complaint was also about, wages. There was I filed a complaint regarding discrimination in pay. That's my right. I went to school. I There's a certain standard level of pay salary that the government says you can have based on your qualifications. And when I saw I was being discriminated against, I properly filed. But I saw that I was retaliated against, and they used violence against me. I was swatted by, uh, rogue management of the Department of the Navy, who instigated cops to come and raid me in my home using false accusations, false allegations. They used somebody who is impersonating as my family to file false accusations. Took it as far as my neighbors, right? Did all sorts of corrupt things, right? To falsely accuse me and raid me in my home and then shoot me, use violence on me. They almost killed me. I have these stitches, these permanent scarring on my forehead now where I was stitched because I was shot by the police in my head. This takes, it takes one back to the medieval, straight out of the arc actions by corporate interests who were able to hire private police in the Homestead Strike of 1892, in which they actually killed workers just demanding better wages, better working conditions, which is their rights. That's part of their liberty interest. And so, I guess, I start because I don't like the angst and the persecution against the wealthy and their children. I don't like it. But when one sees some of the actions of people in management, in corporation, and even our government's supposed to be government of we the people, but it's not acting like a corporation. What's funny is that our management, right, in the federal government or state government, they're incompetent. Most of them are very incompetent. Most of them have never had any experience in the private industry where there's a profit motive, so they have to be efficient. In the government, because there's no profit motive, it turns out the management in the government, they're often not efficient. They're not effective. The alternative of profit making, right? Efficiency for profit making is to cut waste. Cut waste in the federal government. Um, but there's so much corruption and fraud in the federal government that they don't cut waste anyway. Mismanagement um, is supposed to be part of misconduct, right? It's something that they can get penalized for. But you see, it goes on in the federal government anyway. So this video anyway, my objective was to point out that we have had wealthy presidents. There's this misconception that most of our presidents, were poor, came from impoverished backgrounds, and pulled themselves up by by the bootstraps, like Abraham Lincoln. That's not the case, right? Those who've been poor were actually few, right? A few, and majority of them have been middle class. Many have been from actually wealthy backgrounds. Many of our presidents, in fact, Abraham Lincoln, who's famously supposed to have pulled himself up by the bootstraps, he actually was descended from wealthy people. The Lincoln family of Virginia were actually very wealthy. His grandfather had 400 acres, but due to primogeniture, his father did not have wealth. His father was the second son. He was not the first son in any event. And so his uncle Mordecai Lincoln inherited his father's estate. Lincoln's father had to go and make his own way and become, try and be successful. He wasn't successful. And so, but there's a certain dignity and resourcefulness that the wealthy are able to pass on to their descendants, right? And so Lincoln were very fortunate. He was able to pull himself up by the bootstraps. He was able to learn, become a lawyer, and he was able to, he got opportunities and he made the most of those opportunities. I don't like the term pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, right? You have to be given boots in the first place. You're not gonna discover boots if you are truly impoverished and can't afford anything. So we all should look out for one another, and we should get some kind of assistance to help one another, get ahead. It's a good thing to get ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. But, empathy is very crucial. And the Homestead Strike reminds us of, these wealthy, sometimes they lack empathy, and, just uh, they do not show humanity to many of their workers. And that is not to justify, killings or violence. Violence is never to be resorted to. In any event, so I'm going to go into our presidents who were wealthy, starting off with the beginning. Abraham Lincoln, no, sorry, our very first president, George Washington, was one of the wealthiest presidents. He was born into, a middle class family, right? Family that his father owned slaves, unfortunately, owned lands. He wasn't amongst the wealthiest. Uh, Abraham Lincoln was, sorry, I keep saying Abraham Lincoln, of course, because he's my favorite president. George Washington, he he was orphaned early, but he worked very hard, and with what he had inherited, he became a surveyor. Was very good at what he did as a land surveyor, and land access to land was the source of wealth, in the colonies back then, and he became one of the wealthiest landowners. It helped him though that he married the wealthy Martha Custis, who was a widow, she was a wealthy widow, and she had a lot of money, and so he acquired her wealth as well, and he became one of our wealthiest presidents. He was one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. He was a wealthy man, and John Adams wasn't wealthy, but he's our first president to have gone to Harvard. His father was a shoemaker. Uh, the third president, Thomas Jefferson, was very wealthy. In today's dollars, they say his wealth would have been about 250 to $300 million. He inherited a lot of wealth. He came from a wealthy family, the Randolphs. The same thing with James Madison. He came from a very wealthy slave owning family that had a lot of land. He came from a wealthy family as well. The same thing as James Monroe. James Monroe, his father died, I think, when he was about 16. He had to leave school because of that. So he was wealthy. He came from a very wealthy family as well. So you see, our early presidents actually were born wealthy. They came with wealth, right? Majority of them, of the early presidents, right? So, what's interesting though is that the presidency left many of them impoverished. They became bankrupt and insolvent. So the early presidents, they didn't have a pension. Working as a president back then was sure to dissipate your wealth, right? So our early presidents were insolvent, including James Monroe. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, even George Washington, except John Adams and John Quincy of the first 10, but most of them were died insolvent. Andrew Jackson wasn't born wealthy. Andrew Jackson became a wealthy man, though. He became very wealthy. So that's the thing. Many of our presidents, the few who weren't born wealthy, became wealthy. Um, so Andrew Jackson became wealthy. William Henry Harrison was born to, he came from a wealthy family. He came from a wealthy family. He he lost a lot of his wealth by being in public service for a long time, and so the presidency sort of helped him. Right, he lived in a palatial home by the time he became president. Of course, he's our president with the shortest tenure. He died just 1 month after becoming president. Um, Now, Millard, Martin Van Buren, middle class. So most of our presidents, apart from the ones being wealthy, others were middle class, like Martin Van Buren. By the way, Martin Van Buren is the first president, our only president for whom English was a second language. So he came from Dutch stock in New York, and his father was like owned some kind of parlor or inn or whatever. So he he didn't come from wealth. He became a lawyer. Then Millard Fillmore is our president. He was born in 1800, and Millard Fillmore was actually born poor, right? His family was very impoverished, about 8 children. I think he was the second. So he was sent off early. He didn't have formal education. He was sent off to work in like some kind of, to work for a tailor or some kind of cotton shop. And so he called it his working condition close to slavery. But he worked very hard and he became a lawyer. He was determined to make something of himself. He became a lawyer, and he of course became president. After his presidency, though, he was smart enough to marry a very wealthy woman. He married a woman, Caroline McCom, um, uh, what was her name? Macintosh. She was wealthy. Her father was a bank president, and of course, her husband had been a very wealthy man. So he ended up living in a mansion. They were very wealthy. He after his presidency, and he ended up enjoying great wealth. After his presidency, because he married a very wealthy woman, and this is something that many of our presidents did. From George Washington, he married a very wealthy woman. Abraham Lincoln, even though he became a lawyer, he married a woman from a wealthy family. So many of them did that. Lyndon B. Johnson is another president who came from poverty. He came from poverty, but he married a wealthy woman, right? Lady Bird came from a wealthy family, and Lyndon B. Johnson, through investments, people question how he did it, how he got these investments in media, the media empire. He became one of our wealthiest presidents. Now, today, of course, the wealthiest president we've ever had is Donald Trump, right? His father was wealthy. He was born wealthy, and his wealth is supposed to hover between 2 billion and $7 billion. We don't know exactly, but now Donald Trump is the wealthiest president we've ever had. The second wealthiest president we've ever had is John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, his estimated wealth was about $1 billion, but of course that's because his father was one of the richest men in America, right? Joe Kennedy was supposed to have made his money from the stock market, stockbroking, speculation and insider trading and things like that. He eventually became chairman of the SEC, and he created regulation to be able to check and curtail such practices that made him wealthy. The mafia claim he made his money through bootlegging as well. I don't know. Something I want to say about the wealthy, right? People don't realize that the wealthy, when people become wealthy, they provide security to their children, and so their children they don't train their children to pursue money, right? Instead, they train often instill in their children values, and they should pursue values, they should pursue reputation, values, service, maybe to go and work in government, or to help humanity. And something that I want to point out is that slavery is called the original sin in America. Our early abolitionists, and I don't see it said often enough, our early abolitionists actually came from wealthy families, right? So the early abolitionists who were very vocal, who were very proactive in eliminating slavery, they came from wealthy families. Today, we always talk about Abraham Lincoln. Again, Abraham Lincoln's ancestors in America were actually very wealthy. The Lincolns were very wealthy. By the time of his father, unfortunately, his father, didn't have money because he wasn't the first son. So there was a law of primogeniture in England, and of course, these people, of course, the founding fathers, the early colonists were actually British men, right? They're British people. So England had a law of primogeniture from about the 12th century up to about 1925 when they had, was it the Land Property Act or something like that? But uh, primogeniture basically means the firstborn inherits all the wealth, right? Firstborn son. No primogeniture, and it goes to the son. The first son inherits all the wealth, and it meant the others had to find their way. I'll do a video uh, discussing the socioeconomic structure in Europe and how America came to be. Right now, because I want to keep this video short, so I'm still just going to talk about the wealth of our presidents. So um, John F. Kennedy is the second richest president we've ever had. Donald Trump is number one. John F. Kennedy, his wealth is supposed to be estimated at about $1 billion, right? And the third is supposed to be possibly George Washington. His wealth supposed to hover about $500 million in today's dollars. There's a way that financial wizards are able to compute um, they're able to compute money back then and bring it down to present day dollars, right? To guesstimate, do a good calculation, reasonable calculation, right? And they include other factors, a number of factors that would have affected the value of money from time past, the time you're looking for, and that you're comparing it to date, right? So, and apart from George Washington, I've mentioned Thomas Jefferson, uh, and also there's Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, came from a wealthy Dutch family. His estimated wealth is supposed to be over $100 million, which he inherited, and of course, he went into business himself. And of course, there's FDR, his distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as well. He had a very wealthy father who was a railroad executive, and he inherited wealth from his father as well. So we've had numerous wealthy presidents. Apart from those who had actual wealth, there were others who had status and prestige. They were upper middle class. So the thing about being in upper middle class or going to the right schools is you have access to the wealthiest people, right? And when you have access to the wealthiest people networks, this is can actually be converted into money as well, right? Networking, the right contacts makes you money. That's actually how Andrew Carnegie became wealthy. It wasn't his hard work, just working. He was moving in the right circles. He got introduced to the right people, and of course, his hard work and his business acumen, he was able to. He became richer uh, than the rich people he that gave him the proper contacts and networks and access that he needed to get into his good business deals, right? So, so people within for instance, so if you go to the Ivy Leagues, there's a reason why many people want their kids to go to the Ivy Leagues. Not to say that they're the smartest, right? That's not what happens in Ivy Leagues, right? It's actually one of the other reasons a main reason is because majority of the people, over 90% of the people in Ivy Leagues actually come from very wealthy homes, right? And so, you see the Bill Gates. Bill Gates went to an Ivy League. Bill Gates' grandfather had been a bank president. His father was the wealthiest lawyer in Washington, the state of Washington, right? So you have your classmates, your contacts, and so you see many of them. They start businesses with their classmates, their friends. You become friends. You're in the same circle. That's how the wealthy keep getting wealthier, right? Uh, their associations with themselves, right? They do their business deals together, So I'm going to include many of our presidents who came from upper class families and got to go to these elite schools, like William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft, he didn't come from a wealthy family, but he came from a family that had access, and they were top government officials. Like his dad had been a judge, had been a secretary of war under President Grant, had been attorney general. That's his father. So not very wealthy, but not poor. So that's upper middle class. That's President William Howard Taft, who he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after he left office as president. He's our only president who served as a United States Chief Justice as well of the Supreme Court. So there's also Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce's father had actually been governor of New Hampshire, right? So, yeah, Franklin Pierce. Of course, there's the Bush family. The Bush family, uh, you know, George Bush the senior became a successful businessman, and he got into the oil business. So the Bush family had relative wealth as well, and um, most of our presidents, like I said, have actually come from means. Now Nixon is always talking about how he came from was always talking about how he came from a very poor background, right? He was so poor, even though he was admitted to Harvard University, he couldn't go because he couldn't afford to go and school at Harvard, even though he was admitted, and so. He did end up going to Duke Law School, though, and of course, Duke. That's another place where many wealthy people are gathered, and so it gives you access. And he went on to become, of course, senator, congressman, and vice president, and eventually president. And our only president who resigned from office, right? And Americans, he tried so hard to prove he was not a crook. Till today, Americans think he was a crook. Um, and of course, you have Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came from a middle class family, but Bill Clinton, he got access by going to school at Georgetown, where wealthy people go there. The children of wealthy people are there. He got to go to Yale Law School, of course, another school where the children of wealthy people go to. And of course, he went to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. So he got into the circle. He got into the circle of wealthy people, which helped him to become a wealthy person as well. And of course, there's Barack Obama as well. He came from a middle class family as well. And of course, Barack Obama got to go to Columbia University, an Ivy League, got to go to Harvard Law School, another Ivy League. These are places where the children of the wealthiest people in the world, in America particularly, they like to send their kids there. Legacy people go there. They're private universities. They're privately funded. Many people, if they give them donations, right, they allow their kids to come in. They admit the kids of the wealthy because they will continue to fund them. And so you have access, the people who attend those schools often have access to the wealthy. So which other wealthy president have I left out? Of course, there was Benjamin Harrison. His grandfather was President William Henry Harrison. I've talked about that family. William Henry Harrison's father and ancestor was Benjamin Harrison, who was a founding father. And so, you see, as I said, this is consistent. Most of our presidents have actually come from upper class and wealthy backgrounds. At least and if they're middle class, they get some kind of access, right? So those who came from poverty are few. Ronald Reagan came from poverty, but of course he became an actor, and he became rich. He was one of the richest actors in Hollywood. He briefly was entered the A list, and he had one of the best contracts in Hollywood, and of course he became a governor, and he had rich friends. Um, Harry Truman didn't come from money, right? He had came from a lot of hardship. That's President Harry Truman, but he went into politics, and then he became comfortable. And of course, Ike Eisenhower didn't come from money either, and of course he went into the military. Was lucky going into West Point, and he was a career military man, and that's Ike, President Eisenhower. So some presidents, yes, they didn't come from money at all, and but for the most part, most of our presidents, have come from wealthy backgrounds or upper middle class backgrounds. I'm going to stop this video here, and I think I was able to just give the financial backgrounds of our presidents, and address the issue of the persecution of the wealthy, the wrongful persecution of the wealthy in America, which is contradictory in a country that is built on capitalism and encourages pursuing wealth. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also have drawn attention to color of law violations, and the violations of my constitutional rights by a judge, James Bonifant of Montgomery County, Maryland, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court. I've done videos just detailing how my rights were violated, and how there's been fraud on the court, and Judge James Bonifant has actually perpetrated fraud on the court as well. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.